Hello, and welcome to the Formal Review. Today, we'll be talking about the 2021 film, Power of the Dog. Now sit back, relax, grab your drinks. Let's talk about this movie.
What's up, y'all, and welcome back to the Formal Review. This is Season 4, Episode 28, and I thank y'all for tuning in once again. On this episode, I will be discussing and dissecting a new Western film, and I say new, not only because it's a newly made film, but also because it actually redefines a lot of what a Western film has been. So stay tuned. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When I was trying to get this podcast off the ground, I had a lot of questions, like how do I record an episode? How do I get my show into all the apps that people like to listen on? How do I make money from my podcast? The answer to every single one of those questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing my podcast. And best of all, it's absolutely 100% free and ridiculously easy to use. And now Anchor can match you with some great sponsors. That means you can get paid to podcast right away. In fact, that's exactly what I'm doing right now. So if you've always wanted to start a podcast and make money doing it, go to anchor.fm/start to join me and the diverse community of podcasters already using Anchor. Again, that's anchor.fm/start. And I can't wait to hear your podcast. Now, before I get into anything, I do want to preface this episode with a slight spoiler warning, and that's because this film is one of those that has a big spoiler with it, and if I go too much into it, it's going to be definitely spoiler heavy. Now, I will have a section up to a point that is completely spoiler free, and then I'll be getting more into it, and I'll warn you when we get there. But I say that just because I do think you should definitely watch this film before you hear what I have to say about it, so you fully understand everything. But if you don't care about that, you can just keep listening. Also, I know I talk about this at the end, but the data shows that most people don't listen to that part, so I want to talk about it here and reiterate the importance of leaving reviews on your favorite subscription services. I do read those because I do want to grow, because these episodes are really for all you listeners out there, and I want to keep this entertaining. So what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear games? Do you want to hear more of the 4K stuff? Do you want to hear me talk about a certain movie? If you want to come on and talk to me about something, if you want to debate, I'm always open to do stuff like that, so you can always reach out to me on social media. I always want to grow and improve, and
just because something works doesn't mean that it cannot be improved.
So if there's something that you want me to improve on, let me know, and I will grow as such. Anyway, let's sit back, relax, grab your drinks, and let's talk about this movie. Power of the Dog is a psychological drama Western film written and directed by Jane Campion, based on the 1967 novel of the same name written by Thomas Savage. It stars Benedict Cumberbatch, Kirsten Dunst, Jesse Plemons, and Cody Smith-McPhee. Now, Thomas Savage, the author of the original novel, was a gay man, even though he was not as open at the time. And he apparently based a lot of the plot and characters on his own experiences as a teenager growing up on a ranch in Montana. Now, I haven't read the book, but based on what happens in the film, I would hope that the story is largely fictional. So the film is set in 1925 on this Montana ranch, where Phil, played by Cumberbatch, has made his way for himself as this cattle herder, while his brother George, played by Plemons, is fairly dissatisfied with their lifestyle and wants companionship. So he ventures out and he meets Rose, who's played by Dunst, and her son Peter, who's played by Smith-McPhee. He eventually marries Rose and then brings them out to the family farm, but Phil thinks them as weak for the life on the range. Now, this film deals with themes of love, grief, resentment, jealousy, and sexuality. But in a nutshell, it dissects what it means to be a man and how the Western film genre deals with masculinity. Now, Westerns almost always deal with masculinity in some sort of way. It could be a very simple story about heroes and villains in the open country, or even America's history and their desire to conquer the land that is not their own. Now, going back in history, the idea of the American West has been a staple of American growth since really Lewis and Clark ventured past the Mississippi River. And the West really represents a lot of ideals of individualism, tenacity, and strength, and this was aligned with the cowboys who rode horses across the Western plains, and as such, Westerns gave, and some still give, the similar archetypes that really spoke to men watching them. These stories usually have some sort of test that the protagonist must face using tools of masculinity. This person is also good with the ladies and usually gets the girl in the end, even while somewhat in the film being dominant and dismissive of the women in the story. These films really define masculinity with values of strength, courage, and stoicism. And this is shown through Phil, who really sees himself as the ultimate cowboy, even with the hidden values he has. He quotes a dead mentor named Bronco Henry who told him how to survive, and he pushes away anyone outside of his brother that tries to make a connection with him. He doesn't like to be emotional, except when he's by himself. And he does all the dirty work because he believes that he's strong enough to do them alone. He castrates bulls by himself, by hand. He makes his own ropes, and he rarely bathes. He makes up what a clear archetype of what Western men are thought to be. And he represents in a way what used to be and what life was like early on in this country. Now, George represents progression as he desires more domesticity, as such as hosting dinner or having parties with politicians, and this becomes a huge conflict for them because Phil wants to be in this world where he can just prove how tough he is. Initially, Phil comes off as this cruel antagonist, but when one looks at the story and his character, it's not as simple as one would think, as is the entire story. It's not an entire movie about Phil's cruelty to everyone around him. He has buried emotions and layers that all come from his anxiety about what does it mean to be a man. And he dismisses anyone who is, in his mind, less of a man as a way to deny his own sexuality. And this is what really showed me that the film isn't as simple as one would think, even as you're watching it. The finale, which I'll go into in a little bit, wasn't as big a surprise to me as it was for others because of this realization. Now, this is the part that I'm going to go in full into spoilers here, because this really will dissect why the surprise ending is so powerful and how it's not just a cliche ending or any way of that nature. So you've been warned here. So the film all comes to a head when Peter discovers Phil's stash of nude photos of men and sees Phil bathing naked with this handkerchief that belonged to Bronco Henry. Now Phil sees Peter spying on him and chases him off, but then after they apparently strike up this friendship. Now is this friendship real, or is it a forced one that Phil is doing to make Rose's life worse, or is he trying to keep that part of his life that Peter saw a secret and he's afraid of Peter blackmailing him? Now no matter what the viewer thinks of this, Phil starts to become this paternal figure toward Peter by teaching him how to make a rope and then even how to ride a horse. And during one of these lessons, Peter casually asks,
"Do many of the calves die from wolves?"
There's always a few that get tore up or hamstrung or die of anthrax. Call it black leg.
After this, the film shows Peter riding the horse into the mountains where he finds a calf that has died. Now Peter, wearing these protective gloves, carefully removes the calf's hide. And this is to go into making that rope that Phil had taught him how to do. Now, this film has slowly put a lot of misdirection up to this point. Early on, it is learned that Peter is wanting to go to a med school of sorts and likes dissecting animals for educational purposes. So naturally, the thought is that he's just an oddball that likes these weird things. So this scene seems right up his alley, especially then, again, with the learning how to make a rope from calf's hide. This bit doesn't seem too abnormal. Now, later on, Phil takes Peter out to repair a fence, and then while messing around with the rabbit, Phil gets this huge gash on his hand. Now through all this, Rose's drinking is getting worse, and when she hears that Phil is going to burn some of the extra hides instead of selling them to some local Native Americans, she defiantly trades them to the tribe leader for one pair of gloves. Now when Phil realizes this, he is absolutely furious, and he's now no longer able to have enough material to finish Peter's rope. In this moment, Peter offers the hide that he took from that dead calf that he found. Now when Phil asks Peter why does he have it, Peter replies he cuts them up because he wanted to be like Phil, a so-called man. And Phil is so taken aback by these words and kindness in a way that he tells Peter that he's going to work through the night to finish the rope. He then washes the raw hide, completely unaware where that cow came from. Now, because of what has happened up to this point, it can be inferred that the connections here of we've learned that anthrax is a problem, we've learned how to do a rope, and we have learned that Phil has gotten some hide from a dead cow. Now, we don't know if that cow was a diseased cow or if it was just killed by wolves. But this is why it's so significant that when Phil washes the rawhide, his open wound is completely exposed. The next morning, Phil then doesn't come down for breakfast because he has this fever and the wound on his hand is clearly infected. Now the crazy thing is here is that this is the last time Phil is shown on screen, and why doesn't Cambion show him in the hospital? And this is because the film is constantly changing its focus and is also protagonist. One would think, based on how the film is marketed, it is that the protagonist here, or at least main character that we're trying to follow, is Phil. Benedict Cumberbatch is the biggest name on this movie, and especially with Doctor Strange and everything. So of course we're gonna keep track of his character. But is it really his story? And in this moment, the audience can realize that it's not about him anymore. And it's never really been about him in the entire film. This will become more significant in a little bit, but we find out that Phil has died, and at the funeral, it is implied that the whole family will now be able to live peacefully with Phil dead. George invites their family back to the farm, and then the coroner tells George that he thinks he died from anthrax poisoning. Now, this comes as a shock to George because he has always thought that his brother refused to handle diseased animals. Phil, obviously, as knowledgeable as he is, knows to avoid the diseased cows, so one can conclude that if he is to die due to anthrax, it wasn't due to his mistake. Then you remember that the last hide that he touched was the one that Peter gave from him, and now we know that that was a diseased cow. And again, this is something that the film implanted in the viewer's mind from early on, because there's one line of dialogue that there's this current anthrax outbreak.
It's a dead cow. Keep our cattle away.
Happened?
Anthrax, don't touch.
So this is something that one would just think, oh, it's just part of the world that we're living in, which is true. So even when Peter offers Phil the hide, it's soaking. And the film shows Phil plunging his wounded hand into the water. And this bit is very important because Campion is extremely focused on his hand in the water. But then there's this quick scene change to the next morning to keep the audience at ease, but also wondering, why do we focus so much on this little bit? But it's not enough to make you really connect the dots, at least on a first viewing. Then on top of that, Peter doesn't even go to the funeral. Instead, he's at home, and then when Rose and George arrive afterwards, there's this sort of sweet moment where they actually seem to connect again and seem to be happy, even though a close family member has died. And then we see Peter is watching them, and he turns around and smiles. This is the mic drop moment that you know for a fact that he did this. But this has been something that they've been leading up to for the entire film. And then the film shows him reading this Bible verse, Psalm 22:20. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Now one could just interpret that this is where the title of the film comes from, but it's more than that. Psalm 22 is actually about David questioning God's silence in David's desperate situation. And David draws parallels between the attacks of his enemies and those from a horned animal, which is in Psalm 22:12, lions in Psalm 22:13, and dogs in Psalm 22:16. And then in verses 20 and 21, he proceeds to compare the enemy's attacks to those of similar animals, but in reverse order. So by doing this, he brings the imagery in a full circle. So then in verse 22:20, David refers to his own life when he says, my darling. Now there's another Jewish interpretation of Psalm 22 with Esther, who is the legendary Jewish queen of Persia. Then there's another interpretation that this is a prophecy about Jesus Christ's suffering during the crucifixion, with the sword denoting the authority of the Roman government in the Jewish lands, and my darling being Christ offering his own life for the sins of others. Then the power of dog is essentially referring to Jesus' enemies coming together to attack him like a pack of dogs. Then there's another Christian interpretation of this that regards the sword as a metaphor for complete destruction. So in this viewing, my darling is a representative of the human soul, while the power of the dog means the power of Satan. Now the difference here is that unlike David, Peter has basically taken matters into his own hands instead of waiting around for God. He is the sword in this film. The main focus of the film, though, is on the latter part of the verse. So Peter disguises his death sentence as this gift, and everyone, including Phil, thinks it is a gift. And this is because Peter saw what Phil was doing and his impact on the others around him. He saw that his mother was drinking more because Phil was tormenting her from the first night on the farm. And then Phil actually has a scene of burning roses in front of Rose. And then Peter is even almost brought to tears by Phil early on in the story. So he's been cooking up this plan all along, and he sees himself sort of this angel of vengeance, which goes back to the opening voiceover and him wanting to be a protector of his mother.
When my father passed, I wanted nothing more than my mother's happiness. For what kind of man would I be if I did not help my mother?
And interestingly, this is what I was going into when it comes to switching the narrative of who the protagonist is, because this film starts off with this line and it switches into you caring more about Phil. Again, it's because it has to do with who Benedict Cumberbatch is. So obviously he's the main character of the story, but when you know that this first line is actually spoken by Peter, it adds a whole nother level to the film. The ending here is not vague at all, and it's absolutely chilling once you realize everything that has been building up to this moment. It's a twist, but not in the traditional way. The problem here is that while I noticed most of the clues coming up to this, most people may need to watch the film twice to get everything. And honestly, films should not always require a rewatch right after you finish it, unless it's supposed to be ambiguous, which this film isn't. The ending is very much definitive. If you rewatch it again, there is a real tight plot that really clicks into place at the end, which ends up being extremely satisfying. On a first watch though, it's very possible that this watch could be very unpleasant. The only thing that really did bother me was that the film honestly keeps who the protagonist is vague, and that does give a lack of trust with a lot of the characters, but at the same time it also allows the viewer to almost be a viewer of these people's lives instead of looking into the background and trying to connect with them as characters. Now this can either be a really bad thing or a really good thing depending on the viewer. Now otherwise, Durst's performance as Rose is some of the best work she's done in years. Clemens does a fine job, as does Cumberbatch, but the standout here is Smith-McPhee as Peter. He initially is this sensitive teen trying to make his mother happy, but as the film plays out, he really brings the character's brutal side to the front. And thanks to the wonderful script and direction, Campion is able to keep this fairly antagonistic yet fraternal dynamic with Phil and Peter that really is absolutely fascinating to see on screen. Now, for better or worse, Campion doesn't dive into the characters as much as one would expect for a story like this. Even so, the film is an absolutely fascinating watch, and it dissects masculinity in the Western film genre and really takes down the toxic parts of them, both literally and figuratively. Honestly, the film succeeds with its direction, its details, its characters, its ending, and about 95% of its story. And I say that because you need the rewatch to fully appreciate the film for what it is, and that is a very, very tight film. What is your favorite Western, and does it show a lot of masculine-focused tropes? Let me know. Hit me up on social media.
The Formal Review is on Facebook, Twitter, and the Gram, and also YouTube. The handle's all the same. It's at The Formal Review. And for anyone who has supported me on a financial basis, I thank you very much for supporting me in that way. For anyone who wants to support, you can go to anchor.fm/The Formal Review. Click support this podcast, and any donation is appreciated. Thank you all again for tuning in. And until next time, wash your hands.
If you're able to, get vaccinated.
And I'll see you at the movies.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Formal Review. Cheers, and we'll see you next time.
Characters.